to Introduction to Aerodynamic Objects Tutorial 6, my first glider. And in this tutorial we're going to set up a glider with aerodynamic objects and learn how to undertake flight experiments. So our objectives: we're going to set up and organise a free-flying glider model and a scene to test it in. Then we're going to use some flight experiments in Aerodynamic Objects to find aircraft and launch settings that make the glider fly well. And then lastly, we're going to use a fluid zone to simulate some rising air so we can do some soaring flight with our aircraft. So this is the scene diagram for tutorial 6. It's pretty similar to tutorial 5, except we've now got a port wing and a starboard wing. But the main difference is the work under the hood in terms of the organisation we're going to do to set up the model in a logical way. And one of the key skills in using aerodynamic objects is to be able to set up models so that they're easy to debug and easy to maintain. So here we are in Unity. I've created a new scene called Tutorial 6, and that's based on saving the endpoint of Tutorial 5 as Tutorial 6. And we're going to start with this glider on a gimbal and do some work to turn it into something that can fly as a free flight glider. Quite a lot of the stuff we're doing is Unity busy work in terms of reorganizing stuff, but that's an important part of making models that you can easily debug and extend. So first off, let's do a little bit of housekeeping, renaming. In the previous example, Rod was a good name for the bar on the weather vane, but actually, since we're making an aircraft, let's call that fuselage. And more than that, this fuselage is part of a larger aircraft, so what I'm going to do is actually create a parent object to that. So create empty parent and call that glider. And what we want is the glider to be the master rigid body for the whole aircraft. So what I'm going to do is add rigid body to that, 10 kilograms. Let's get rid of Unity angular drag. So this is our top level, and best practice is you always have your rigid body at the top level. So if we go to the fuselage there, we can now remove the fuselage that was on there, and we can remove that component. Great, let's get some other stuff organized. So here we've got two parts of the tail. It would make a lot more sense if they were from the same parent object, so call that tail. There we go. Wing, we're going to start again, so actually I'm going to just delete that, that's easiest. And in terms of the organization, the tail is at the same level as the fuselage in terms of objects, and actually I'm going to move up the center of gravity marker up to the highest level as well, so we can see that quite clearly. Center of gravity marker is a prefab because we supplied it. It's kind of a bit distracting that it's blue in there, so what I'm going to do is just do right click prefab, and I'm just going to do unpack. We don't ever need to change that, so it's fine to do that. Okay, tail doesn't quite look like a tail on an aircraft, so let's sort that out now. I'm going to do so. It's the vertical stabilizer, and we know it's the geometry because we're changing the shape, and I'm going to set it to a height of 1 and offset it by 0.5. Okay, that looks more like an aircraft tail. Whilst we're on the tail, there was when we created the aero objects last time in tutorial 5, when I put the sphere glider on, I forgot to click is trigger, and it didn't matter for tutorial 5, but it will matter for this one because we want to get rid of all our physical gliders. So I'm going to click is trigger on there. And the other thing, if you look on here, since we moved our rigid body, it's now disappeared. So off here, the reference is missing, so we need to re-reference the rigid body that we changed to on the glider. So now that's going to talk to the main rigid body. And I don't know if you noticed there, if you're familiar with this or not, but you can do multi-object editing in Unity. So I've clicked both aero objects there, so I'm doing the same operation on both objects, and that saves a lot of time. What I'm also going to do in here, we don't really need the wind arrow on the tail anymore, so in fact I'm just going to remove that component. We'll leave the lift arrow on, that's useful, but we've removed the wind arrow. Okay, so let's build some wings. If I'm selected the glider, and then I right click on it, create empty, creates a new game object. One thing to check is if you're not on the parent object when you create a new game object, it may not be at 0, 0. So if when you're creating things they're appearing all over the place, just check that they start at 0, 0, 0, because that's the reference point for our aircraft. And we're going to call that wings, and create empty underneath there, and we call that starboard wing. So I do get accused of over-organizing my models, but the alternative is chaos. Adding in additional parenting and everything else really helps you finding stuff. It does create a little bit of performance overhead, and if you really want to optimize this, you can collapse it all down to single levels. But when you're developing stuff, it's much better to keep a rich hierarchy of objects. So starboard wing, and I'm going to create the geometry underneath there. This is slightly different to what we did before. Last time we created the graphic there and called it geometry. You'll see what we're doing in a minute. I'm now then going to create the graphic underneath there, and I'm going to call that offset. And the reason we do that is we're going to make a starboard wing, so what we want to do is offset that by 0.5 that way. And so what you see there now is we started building our wing on the right hand side, and if you do rescale you can see why. So now when we scale it, it's a right hand side wing. Dimensions we want: the semi-span of the aircraft is going to be 4, so 8 meters overall span. It's going to be 5 centimeters thick wing, and the chord is going to be 1. Okay, that looks okay. To make this thing fly better, we're going to give it some dihedral, so that's the wings bending up at the tips, and that means when you start flying sideways, the wingtips picked up and it straightens up, and you need that for a glider. So 6 degrees is about right for that. Okay, let's add some aerodynamics to the wing. So we're in the offset game object. I'm going to do right click, create empty, and call that Aero Objects as before. We're going to add our Aerodynamic Object component, so Aero Object, and we want drag and lift, and then the rigid body that the forces are going to be applied to is the glider, so drag that in. When we have the fluid zone on, we want this aerodynamic object to pick up the wind coming from the fluid zone. So I'm going to add in a sphere collider as a trigger and make it small so it's not visually in the way. That's good. So we've got lift and drag. We're picking up fluid speed from the fluid zone, and now let's put on some visualization components so we can see what the forces are. So put a wind arrow on, and I'm going to make this slightly smaller so it doesn't get visually in the way. So diameter of 0.1, sensitivity of 0.1, and I'm going to add a lift arrow with the same scaling on it and a drag arrow. Okay, that's good. Before we duplicate the wing on the other side, let's add some smoke particles to the tip. We're not doing that just because it looks nice. It really helps us visualize what the aircraft is doing. So let's apply them at the level of the starboard wing. So I've double clicked on the starboard wing and right click Aerodynamic Objects, and then flow point particles. So what I'm now going to do is drag these out to the wingtip. Doesn't matter exactly where they are. I'll go into ortho mode so I can see what's going on. So put it about there, and then from the top. Okay, that's good. So some smoke at the wingtips, and that's our starboard wing created. So we've got our aero body there, which is the blue mesh that we can see, and then there's this larger kaleidosphere on the end there is for the particle generator at the tip, and this collider is not associated with the dynamics of the rest of the body, so we can ignore its effects. Okay, let's do another wing. So as we're smart and lazy, we are going to duplicate the wing rather than start again. So what I'm going to do is select the wing, do Control D, and I'm going to rename it as port wing, and I'm going to shift it to the other side by changing the offset. So put that as -0.5, and there we go, our wing goes across the other side. The dihedral is symmetric there, so we want to make it anti-symmetric, so let's change that to -6 there. And we also need to transfer across the point particles, so they've been left in the same place. Once again, because we're smart and lazy, let's just change the sign of that and it'll go across the other side. So let's just check everything now. So we've got our complete wing, we've got 2 aero bodies, we've got 2 sphere kaleidos, triggers on the wings, and we've got our particles at the wingtips. So getting there, we've got our centre of gravity at the top level, we've got our aero bodies set up, they're sending their forces to the rigid body as required, but we still need a little bit of code to get our aircraft launched. So what we need to be able to do is just when we run the simulation, we just want it to start with a given velocity and direction. So if we go up to glider, what we're going to do is add a component called aircraft manager, and it's going to be aircraft manager 6, and it's the same as in 5. We've got a center of mass marker there of where it's going to put the center of gravity. So if I drag that in there, but we also now need to set a launch speed, and this literally just sets the velocity of the rigid body at the start of the simulation, and we'll leave these two the same. So Gizmo's off for now. Okay, before we fly, let's put some context in. So let's put some ground in so we can see where we're flying from. So if we go to prefabs and add in our ground plane from before, and I'm going to put that above the aircraft to keep it out of the way, and click on the glider. Let's just get it above the ground. And then for some scale, let's put our Aeroman figure in. There he is. And since we want to be able to see him properly in this time, if we go to materials and Aeroman material, it's set to fade at the moment, but if you put that to opaque, it means he'll render properly so we can see what he's doing. Okay, and there is no need to do this whatsoever, but it kind of looks like the Aeroman is trying to fly the glider. So let's give him the glider to hold, and then it'll look like he's launching it. There we go. So he's holding up his glider. The glider only weighs 10 kilograms, so he should be able to hold it up quite nicely. And there we go. We're all set. Let's check where we put the center of gravity. Let's just tidy that up a little bit. Let's just call that 0.2. So that's 20 centimeters ahead of the middle of the wing. So that's 30 centimeters ahead of the leading edge. And that's about right place for a well-balanced aircraft. Somewhere between the quarter of the way back and half the way back is a good place for center of gravity. But one of the things you have to do is move the center of gravity around to get the kind of level of stability that you want, and we'll have a go at doing that in a minute. Our tail is set up that it's completely flat at the moment. So if you remember from the previous tutorial, if there's no trim angle on the tail, this plane will just fly with the wing at 0 angle of attack. So it won't actually fly. It'll just sort of move like an arrow and won't generate any lift. But let's just leave that the defaults just to see what happens. What else we need to do? Let's turn the wind. We've got the wind field here in the moment, and I'm just going to turn that off completely because we don't want to be confused by what wind is doing. We just want the motion of the aircraft. And the other thing we want to do is set up our cameras so that they can have a good idea of what's going on. So if I do a top view, and if we set up the ground camera first, So that's over there. That's okay. If we're launching that way, it would make more sense to put it over there so it kind of sees the plane coming towards it. And we'll set the initial angle just so we can see the plane. Default distance is 10 meters. That's probably a bit close in terms of the kind of zoom thing, so I'm going to set that to, let's say, 25 meters. The other thing it needs to be able to track it, it needs the target it's looking at, so we're going to use the glider top level transform as what it's looking for. That's good. And in terms of the cameras, the default camera is on orbital at the moment. Let's just set that as ground view, so we when it starts off it's just using the ground view camera. We may want to have a look at it in flight in a minute, so actually let's set this one up. So we've got the glider once again. The target for this sort of orbital camera is the glider, and we'll pretty much leave these as they are. Let's make that to 15. Okay, I think we're ready. Okay, we've got it all set up. Aeroman's holding the glider, and then when we press play, hopefully the glider will go forwards and we'll see if it flies or not. Okay, that was alright as a first flight. It went forwards, it wasn't unstable, but it didn't really do anything. So what we could do now is just try throwing it harder. So stop that, go to a glider, and let's just throw it harder. Okay, let's just throw it twice as hard. See what happens. Okay, so it goes a bit further. It's stable, but it's not really flying terribly well. It's just sort of coming straight down. And we could do something inadvisable, like just chuck it up and see what happens. So he chucks the glider up. That's kind of flying, but actually it's more like sort of falling with style, that one. It's not really flying very well at all. And the reason is that we haven't got any trim on the aircraft, so this thing, the wing is effectively trying to trim at zero angle of attack and there's no lift. So let's get in and put some trim on the tail. So it's going to be the horizontal stabilizer and it's the geometry. And what we're going to do is set a trim angle. Let's go a bit closer so we can see what's going on. So it's about the Y axis, and we're going to set a trim angle of -4. So it's not a huge amount, but that's enough to get this thing balanced at a positive angle of attack. And what we're also going to do, let's put it back to a 0 launch elevation and 10 meters per second launch speed. Yeah, slightly better. Could do better than that. Let's try chucking it a little bit harder. Let's do 15. And there we go. We cleared the floor. That's flying. Let's have another look. Let's go into cameras and set orbital as our default camera. And there we go. We can follow our glider when it's flying. Off it goes at the end. So it climbs slightly when we let go of it, which shows that we're actually flying, throwing a bit harder than we need to. So what I'm going to do is reduce this to 12. And that's pretty good. It's gliding nicely. It's coming down in a steady fashion. What we could try there is we just give a little bit more elevator. Tailplane is now set at a slightly larger angle. Okay, so that's proper flying. That's brilliant. So this is a glider. It always flies downhill, doesn't have an engine on, but since we're creators, why don't we create some rising air for this glider to fly in, so like a thermal you might find in nature, and if there's some rising air, then the glider will stay in the air for a bit longer. So we're going to turn on our wind field and get it set up. At the moment you can see it's relatively small, not big enough for our glider to fly in, so what we're actually going to do is make it 20 times bigger than that, and that'll give us a nice big space for the glider to fly in. There we go. I'm going to leave it centered around the glider rather than move it up, just because the glider might fly underneath the plane at some point. So we've got our fluid zone there, and what we're going to do is we want rising winds, so we want the wind to be coming up at 90 degrees, and let's make sure turbulence is disabled, and let's set a velocity of 2 meters a second going up. So flow field visualization, let's go nuts and have 10 by 10 arrows so we can really fill the whole space, and let's make them a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Focus point, we want to set that to the glider, and our fluid zone is already set up. Okay, so that's our fluid zone set up. So now when we launch the glider, it should be in some rising air. So let's give this a go. And there we go. The glider is sort of maintaining its altitude just about. It's going up and down. Oh, and then we've flown out the fluid zone now, so we're just coming straight down. That's all very well, but if we want to make the glider fly for a longer time, we could make the fluid zone infinitely bigger, or we could do the smart thing of getting the aircraft to fly in a circle. So what we're going to do that is put a offset in the fin angle, and that's going to make the aircraft turn. So if we go to the vertical stabilizer, and if we take the rotation in the y-axis there, and if we set that to 7, if you look carefully there, the fin now has been twisted to one side, so when the plane is flying, there's going to be a side force on the fin which is going to push the fin to the right and the nose to the left, so the aircraft is going to turn left when it flies. Let's see what happens. And there we go, we're making a left turn. Flying through our rising air, we're just about maintaining our altitude, that's good. Just made it back, and we're carrying on turning. Okay, we're slightly running out of altitude there. I think next time round we're not going to make it back all the way. Well, that's fine, we're now going to descend through the fluid zone beneath the plane. Fantastic. Just to show we know what we're doing, let's change the fin angle to the other way. Let's put it at -5, so it's a slightly more gradual turn, and let's see what that does. So yeah, we're turning to the right. Okay, so we've just seen what happens when you vary the trim of the aircraft. Now let's see what happens when we vary the stability by moving the centre of mass. So imagine we're loading up our aircraft and we put the mass far at the back. Let's see what happens there. Okay, so that's no good, that's unstable. And equally, let's look if we push the centre of gravity too far forwards. In that case, it is flying, but because it's very nose heavy, it's just going to be flying at a very fast dive. Our happy spot for the centre of gravity is going to be somewhere around here, roughly back to where we started. That's slightly further back. But there we go, that's a happy plane that's stable and trims, so it's flying nicely. Great, so that brings us to the end of this tutorial. So we've done quite a lot of work in this tutorial reorganizing our original aircraft model. So we've given it 2 wings, we've done a reorganized structure with a glider game object at the top which has the rigid body. We added 2 wings, each with their own aerodynamic objects on them. We set some dihedral, and we added some smoke trails at the wingtips to see what's going on. And then in terms of flying, we learned that if you don't have any angle on the tail, the plane just basically falls with style. So you need to set some angle of attack of the wing by altering the tailplane angle, so in a downward sense. And that will make it fly nicely in a straight line. And then if you want your plane to fly in circles, you have to put some angle on one of the surfaces. So there we go, we've got a fully working plane. It needs some rising air to keep it aloft. So in the next tutorial what we're going to do is build ourselves an engine, a propeller engine to stick on the front of this plane, and that means it can generate its own power to take off, so it doesn't need rising wind. And if we give it some wheels, it should be able to do a rolling takeoff and fly like a real plane.